the lone cowboy whispered to the widow. "I'd trade 10 herds for one night with you." For many years, the people of Dry Creek had grown used to the sight of Cole Turner riding alone across the open plains. He was tall in the saddle, straight-backed and steady, like the land itself. His hat was always pulled low, shading eyes that had seen too much and said too little. When he rode into town, it was usually for supplies, cattle feed, or to settle business at the auction yard. He spoke only when necessary, nodded in greeting, and left before anyone could start a long conversation. No one could remember a time when Cole laughed loudly in public or stayed long enough to share stories. He paid fairly, worked hard, and kept his word. That was enough for most people. In a place like Dry Creek, a man did not need to be friendly if he was honest. Still, there was always a quiet curiosity about him. He owned more land than anyone else around. His cattle were strong, his ranch well kept, yet for all his success he lived in a house that stayed dark most evenings, except for one lamp that burned late into the night. Long ago, Cole had not been alone. Years back, sickness had swept through the region, taking with it his parents and later the woman he once planned to marry. Those were not things he spoke about. The loss settled inside him like dust after a storm. At first, he had tried to fight the silence by working harder. He bought more cattle. He expanded his land. He pushed himself from sunrise to well past sunset. The more he gained, the less he felt. Over time, he stopped expecting warmth from life. He found comfort in routine. Animals were simpler than people. They did not ask questions about pain. On the other side of town stood Hale's General Store. It had been there for decades, with wooden floors that creaked and shelves packed tightly with flour sacks, canned goods, tools, and fabric rolls. After her husband passed away 3 winters ago, Margaret Hale began running it alone. Many people had doubted her at first. They wondered if she could manage the accounts, the deliveries, and the daily demands without help. But Margaret surprised them all. She was not loud or showy. She moved with quiet confidence. Every morning before sunrise, she swept the front steps and unlocked the door. She kept careful records in a neat ledger. She remembered who preferred strong coffee and who needed extra time to pay off their tabs. Her hair, once darker, now carried strands of silver, usually tied back in a simple bun. There was a softness in her face, but also strength. Loss had touched her too. Her husband had been her partner in everything. When he died suddenly from illness, she thought the store would close for good. For weeks, she could barely step behind the counter without feeling the weight of his absence. But grief, she learned, could either break a person or shape them. She chose to let it shape her. Evenings were the hardest. After closing, when the last customer left and the lamps burned low, the quiet inside the store grew heavy. She would sit behind the counter counting coins, listening to the tick of the old clock on the wall. Sometimes she caught herself turning toward the back room, almost expecting her husband to step out with a smile and a fresh idea for improving business. The empty doorway reminded her that life had changed forever. It was late summer when Cole's path crossed hers in a way that neither expected. The cattle auction that day had drawn ranchers from miles around. Dust hung in the air, and the noise of bidding echoed across the yard. Cole had sold a strong group of steers and earned more than he anticipated. Men clapped him on the back, praising his sharp eye for breeding. He responded with brief nods, already thinking about the ride home. But instead of heading straight to his ranch, he turned his horse toward town as the sun began to lower. He told himself he needed supplies. That was true, though it was not the only reason. Over the past few months, he had found himself noticing Margaret whenever he stepped into the store. The way she listened carefully when customers spoke, the calm patience in her voice, the strength behind her tired eyes. When he tied his horse outside the store that evening, the street was nearly empty. A warm orange light spilled through the windows. He pushed open the door, and the small bell above it rang softly. Margaret looked up from behind the counter. She had been counting coins, stacking them into neat piles. For a brief moment, surprise flickered across her face. Cole did not usually come this late. "Evening," she said gently. "Evening," he replied, removing his hat out of respect. He walked slowly through the aisles, picking up a few items he did not urgently need: coffee, lamp oil, a sack of sugar. Truthfully, he could have sent one of his ranch hands for those things. But something about the quiet inside the store drew him in. It felt different from the silence at his ranch. This silence was not empty. It was warm. When he brought the items to the counter, the sky outside had turned deep gold. Dust floated in the air like tiny sparks. Margaret finished counting the coins and slid the ledger aside. She began wrapping his purchases in brown paper. "You did well at the auction today," she said. News traveled fast in Dry Creek. He shrugged lightly. It was a fair price. She handed him the total. He placed the money on the counter, but instead of reaching for his goods, he stayed still. His fingers rested on the warm wood between them. For a moment, neither spoke. Cole was not a man of many words. He had rehearsed nothing in his mind, yet something in him felt restless. He had spent years measuring life by profit and acreage. That day, standing across from her steady gaze, he felt the weight of his own loneliness more clearly than ever before. Margaret sensed it too, the pause that stretched longer than usual. She waited, not pushing him to speak. Finally, his voice came low and honest. He said that he had been thinking lately about what truly held value in a man's life. He admitted that he owned more cattle than he could count and more land than he could walk in a day. Yet when he returned home each night, there was no one to share the quiet with. He looked directly at her then, not boldly, not carelessly, but with sincerity. He told her that if he had to choose between 10 strong herds and one evening sitting across from someone who truly understood him, he would choose the evening. He would trade the herds without hesitation. The words hung in the air, heavier than the dust outside. Margaret did not react with anger or laughter. Instead, her eyes searched his face, trying to understand what lay beneath the statement. She had heard grand promises before in her youth, but this did not feel like empty charm. It felt like a man reaching for something he did not fully know how to ask for. Still, she was cautious. Life had taught her that words, no matter how heartfelt, could fade if not supported by action. That's a heavy trade, she said softly. It is, he replied, but some things weigh more than cattle. The setting sun painted the room in shades of amber and shadow. Outside, a wagon rolled past, its wheels creaking against the dirt road. Margaret finally wrapped the last parcel and slid it toward him. It's getting late, she said gently. You should head back before dark. He nodded, understanding the boundary in her tone. He picked up his hat and the parcels. Before stepping out, he paused at the door. Good night, Margaret. Good night, Cole. The bell above the door rang again as he stepped into the fading light. Margaret remained behind the counter long after he left. She rested her hands on the ledger, staring at nothing in particular. His words echoed in her thoughts. Trade 10 herds. It was not the kind of sentence a man like Cole Turner would speak lightly. Outside, Cole mounted his horse and began the long ride home. The sky above the prairie stretched wide and endless. For the first time in years, the land did not feel quite as large or as lonely. Neither of them knew it yet, but that quiet evening had shifted something small and steady inside both their hearts. The balance of their careful separate lives had begun to change. The morning after that quiet evening felt different, though nothing in Dry Creek had visibly changed. The sun rose as it always did, spreading pale gold light across the open land. Roosters crowed. Wagons rolled slowly down the dirt road. The town woke up in its usual rhythm. But inside Margaret Hale's heart, something stirred that she had not allowed herself to feel in a long time. She unlocked the general store before sunrise, just as she always did. The air was still cool, and a thin layer of dust rested on the wooden steps. She swept carefully, her mind replaying Cole's words from the night before. Trade 10 herds. It was not a foolish compliment. It had sounded honest, almost heavy with meaning, yet she refused to let it settle too deeply. Margaret had once believed in strong promises. When she was young, her husband had stood in this same doorway and told her they would build a life full of hard work and laughter, and they had. For many good years they worked side by side, growing the store and dreaming of small improvements, new shelves, better windows, maybe even a painted sign one day. Then illness came without warning. It did not ask permission. It did not give time to prepare. It simply took him, leaving her with ledgers, debts, and silence. In the months after his passing, many men had offered help, some out of kindness, some out of curiosity, a few out of interest. She learned quickly that sympathy could turn into expectation. She decided she would not lean on anyone. If she were to survive, she would do it standing on her own feet. So when Cole spoke those bold words, she did not melt or blush like a young girl. She measured them. She weighed them carefully in her mind. By mid-morning, the store filled with its usual customers. Farmers came for feed sacks. Children stopped by for penny candy. Mrs. Carter asked about new fabric for sewing. Margaret greeted each person with her steady smile, but she noticed something else too. 2 older men near the flour barrels spoke in low tones. Cole stayed late last night. One said, I saw his horse outside after sunset. the other replied. Margaret pretended not to hear. In a small town, nothing remained private for long. She kept her back straight and her focus on her work. Late in the afternoon, when the rush had slowed and only a few customers remained, the bell above the door rang again. She looked up, half expecting another neighbor. It was Cole. He stepped inside, hat in hand, his expression calm but determined. He did not carry a shopping list this time. Instead, he walked straight toward the counter. "Afternoon," he said simply. "Afternoon," she answered, her tone polite but guarded. For a moment, neither mentioned the night before. He glanced around the store as if studying something carefully. Then his eyes shifted to the small back window where the wooden frame hung slightly crooked. The last storm had loosened it, and Margaret had not yet found time to fix it. "You've got a loose hinge back there," he said. "I'm aware," she replied lightly. "It's on my list." He nodded once. "May I?" She hesitated. Pride had become her shield over the years. Accepting help felt like admitting weakness, but there was no pity in his face, only quiet respect. "If you'd like," she said at last. Without another word, he stepped outside and returned with a small toolbox from his saddlebag. He worked steadily, tightening screws, adjusting the frame, making sure it closed properly. He did not rush. He did not speak much either. Customers watched with raised brows, whispering softly to each other. Margaret stayed behind the counter, pretending to organize receipts, but she watched him from the corner of her eye. There was something sincere about the way he worked. No grand gestures, no attempts to impress. Just careful attention. When he finished, he stepped back and tested the window once more. "That should hold through the next storm," he said. "Thank you," she replied, meaning it. He wiped his hands on a cloth and placed the tools back in his bag. Still, he did not leave. "I meant what I said," he added quietly. She met his gaze. "Words are easy, Cole. I know, and life is not. I know that, too." There was no argument in his voice, no defense, just acknowledgement. That evening, after closing time, she found him again, this time outside, repairing a broken board on the back fence of the store. She stepped out onto the porch, folding her arms. "You don't have to fix everything," she called gently. "I'm not trying to fix everything," he replied. "Just what I can." The simplicity of that answer stayed with her. Over the next few days, his visits continued. Sometimes he bought supplies. Other times he brought small repairs, a tightened hinge, a patched roof shingle, a load of firewood stacked neatly by the back door. He never asked for anything in return. He never repeated his bold statement. Instead, he let his actions speak quietly. The town's whispers grew louder. She's letting him help. Maybe she's ready to move on. Or maybe he's just lonely. Margaret heard it all. At night she lay awake thinking about the difference between loneliness and companionship. She knew loneliness well. It sat beside her at dinner. It echoed in the empty rooms above the store. But companionship, true companionship, was something she had not allowed herself to imagine again. One evening, as the sky turned pale pink, she surprised herself. Instead of waiting for him to show up uninvited, she walked toward the hitching post outside and found him adjusting his saddle. "Cole," she said softly. He turned quickly, almost startled. "If you're not in a hurry," she continued, "you may sit on the porch for a while." It was not an invitation inside. Not yet. But it was a step. He nodded, a quiet gratitude in his eyes. They sat side by side on the wooden porch, leaving a respectful space between them. The town road stretched out before them, dust glowing in the evening light. They spoke about simple things at first. The dry weather, the price of feed, the coming winter. Gradually, the conversation grew deeper. He told her about the early years of his ranch, how he worked through harsh seasons to keep it alive. She shared stories about learning to manage the store's accounts alone. There was no pressure in their words, no promises made, only shared understanding. As darkness settled, Margaret realized something important. Cole was not trying to rescue her. He was not trying to replace her past. He was simply showing up, day after day, steady and patient. Before he left that night, he stood at the bottom of the porch steps. "I won't rush you," he said. "Take all the time you need." "Time is something I value." "So do I," he answered. When he rode away, she remained seated, listening to the fading sound of hooves. Her heart was cautious, but it was no longer closed. Inside, she lit the lamp and glanced around the store. The window no longer rattled. The fence stood straight. The stacked firewood waited neatly for winter. Small changes, perhaps, but meaningful ones. Margaret understood now that trust was not built from bold words spoken once. It was built from quiet actions repeated again and again. And though she would not admit it aloud, she found herself looking toward the door each afternoon, listening for the soft ring of the bell. The wind began to change as autumn slowly arrived in Dry Creek. The air grew cooler in the mornings, and the sky seemed wider somehow, stretched across fields of gold grass. Leaves from the few cottonwood trees near the river turned pale yellow and drifted down like quiet reminders that seasons never stayed the same. Margaret noticed the change not only in the weather but in herself. Cole's visits had become part of her routine. He did not come every day, but often enough that his absence felt noticeable. Sometimes he would bring fresh eggs from his ranch. Other times he would ask if she needed anything carried or fixed. But more and more, he simply came to sit on the porch at sunset. They had developed an easy rhythm. He would tie his horse outside, remove his hat, and greet her with a soft evening. She would close the ledger, lock the front door, and join him outside. The space between them on the bench had grown smaller over time, though neither spoke about it. Still, one question remained in Margaret's mind. One windy evening, as clouds rolled across the sky and dust swirled along the road, she decided it was time to ask. They sat, wrapped in the cool air, watching the sun sink behind the plains. For a while, they listened to the wind brushing against the wooden walls of the store. "Cole," she said quietly. He turned toward her, giving her his full attention. "Why did you say that night that you would trade 10 herds?" she asked. "Why such heavy words?" He did not answer right away. Instead, he looked out across the open land as if searching for the right place to begin. His hands rested on his knees, rough from years of work. "I've had a long time to think about what matters," he finally said. "When I was younger, I believed more land meant more security. More cattle meant more success. I worked day and night chasing that idea." Margaret listened without interrupting. "At first, it felt good," he continued. "Every new herd felt like proof that I was building something strong. But after a while, the ranch grew bigger, and the house felt smaller." She understood what he meant. "There's a difference," he said slowly, "between being busy and being fulfilled. I was busy for years, but when I came home at night, there was no one to share the day with, no one to tell me if I was right or wrong. No one to laugh at small things." His voice remained steady, but there was a quiet weight in it. "When I stepped into your store that evening," he added, "I saw someone who carried loss without letting it harden her. You kept going. You built something out of what was left. That takes more strength than owning 10 herds. Margaret felt a small ache in her chest. No one had spoken about her strength in that way before. "I didn't mean the words as a bargain," he said. "I meant them as truth. Wealth can fill a field, but it cannot fill a heart." The wind softened for a moment, as if the world itself paused to listen. Margaret looked down at her folded hands. "You speak as if you regret your success." "I don't regret the work," he replied. "But I regret believing it was enough." She thought about her own past. When her husband was alive, the store had not been large. They had struggled during some winters, but those were also the years filled with shared laughter, shared worries, shared dreams. After he passed, the store slowly improved under her careful management. Profits became steadier, yet the evenings felt longer. "Loss teaches strange lessons," she said softly. "It does," he agreed. For a while they sat in silence again. The sky had turned deep blue, and the first stars appeared above them. "There's something else," he added. She waited. "I was afraid," he admitted. "Afraid?" she repeated. "Afraid that if I didn't speak that night, I might never speak at all? I've spent years keeping quiet. It becomes a habit. But habits can turn into walls." Margaret understood walls very well. She had built her own strong, careful walls, designed to protect what remained of her heart. "I don't need rescuing," she said gently. "I've learned to stand on my own." "I know," he replied, "and I wouldn't insult you by trying. I don't want to carry you. I want to walk beside you." His words were simple, but they carried steady meaning. Margaret studied his face in the fading light. There was no impatience there, no demand, only sincerity. "Walking beside someone requires trust," she said. "I'm willing to earn it," he answered. The honesty in his voice eased something inside her. Over the next few days, their conversations grew deeper. They spoke about childhood memories, about mistakes they had made, about dreams they once held and let go of. Margaret told him how she almost sold the store after her husband's passing, believing she could not manage alone. She described the night she sat on the floor behind the counter, surrounded by unpaid bills, wondering how she would survive. "What changed your mind?" he asked. "I realized that closing the store would not bring him back," she said, "but keeping it open would honor the life we built." He nodded, understanding that kind of loyalty. Cole shared his own hidden regret, how, after losing those close to him, he shut himself away. Friends stopped visiting. Invitations went unanswered. He told himself he was stronger alone. In truth, he had simply been protecting himself from more pain. "You can't lose what you never allow yourself to have," he said quietly. "But you also can't gain anything that way," Margaret replied. A faint smile touched his face. "Exactly." One afternoon, a strong gust of wind knocked over a display of canned goods inside the store. Without hesitation, Cole knelt beside her to gather the scattered items. Their hands brushed briefly as they reached for the same can. It was a small moment, but it carried warmth. Margaret noticed that she no longer felt guarded around him. She did not measure every word before speaking. She laughed more easily. Customers began to notice the difference, too. "You seem lighter these days," Mrs. Carter remarked one morning. Margaret only smiled. Yet even as her walls lowered, caution remained. She knew that feelings, once awakened, could lead to both joy and risk. One evening, after a long day, she turned to him and asked the question that mattered most. "What happens if this doesn't work?" she asked. "If we try and fail?" "Then we will know we tried honestly," he said. "Failure is not what I fear anymore. Regret is." His response surprised her again. There was strength in accepting uncertainty. The prairie wind moved gently through the tall grass beyond town. Life around them continued as it always had. Wagons passing, children playing, cattle grazing in distant fields. Yet for both of them, something quiet and meaningful was unfolding. Margaret realized that his original words were not about grand sacrifice or dramatic gestures. They were about value. He had spent years counting cattle, measuring success in numbers. Now he was learning to measure it in connection, in shared conversation, in steady presence. And she, who had learned to survive alone, was beginning to see that partnership did not mean weakness. It meant choosing to share the weight of life rather than carrying it in silence. As they rose from the porch that night, Cole did not reach for her hand. He did not push for more than she was ready to give. He simply walked beside her to the store door and waited until she stepped safely inside. "Good night, Margaret," he said softly. "Good night, Cole." As she locked the door and watched him ride into the moonlit distance, she felt something new. Not the rush of youthful romance, but the steady warmth of trust beginning to grow. The man who once measured his life by herds was now measuring it by moments. And the widow who had protected her heart so carefully was beginning to believe that strength and love did not have to stand apart. They could stand side by side. By the time late autumn arrived, the people of Dry Creek no longer pretended not to notice the change between Cole Turner and Margaret Hale. In a small town, even the smallest shift in routine felt as clear as a church bell on a quiet Sunday morning. Cole still rode in with the same steady posture. Margaret still opened and closed the store at the same hours. But now, more often than not, his horse was tied outside near sunset. And more often than not, two shadows could be seen sitting side by side on the porch as the sky turned from gold to deep blue. Some people smiled at the sight. Others whispered. A few simply watched with curiosity. Margaret heard the comments now and then. While measuring flour or cutting fabric, she would catch pieces of conversation drifting through the aisles. "Never thought I'd see the day," one man muttered kindly. "She deserves company," another replied. Margaret did not let the words trouble her. But deep inside she knew that stepping forward with Cole meant stepping into the town's attention as well. She had lived quietly for years. Now her life felt gently exposed. Cole noticed it too. One afternoon, as he helped her unload a small delivery from a wagon, he spoke carefully. "If the talk ever makes you uncomfortable, say the word. I'll keep my distance." She paused, resting a crate against the porch rail. "And let them think I sent you away?" "I don't mind what they think," he said. She studied him for a moment. "Neither do I. Not anymore." That answer stayed with him long after. The days grew shorter. Cold air began to slip through the cracks in the store's wooden walls. One evening, dark clouds gathered faster than expected. The wind picked up suddenly, bending tree branches and sending dust spinning across the street. Margaret had just finished closing the shutters when the first heavy drops of rain began to fall. The sound against the roof was sharp and fast. Within minutes, the storm grew strong. Thunder rolled across the open land, shaking windows and rattling doors. She moved quickly inside, checking for leaks. The roof had been repaired years ago, but time and weather were always testing it. And she heard it, a loud crack from the back corner of the building. Her heart jumped. She hurried toward the sound and saw that part of the roof near the storage room had shifted. Water began to drip steadily through a small opening, landing on a stack of flour sacks. Before she could even think of what to do next, the front door burst open against the wind. Cole stepped inside, rain soaking his coat. "I saw the roof lift from the road," he said quickly. "Are you all right?" Relief washed over her, though she tried not to show it too clearly. "It's leaking in the back." Without wasting time, he moved toward the storage room. The rain pounded harder now, and wind howled around the building. Together they pulled the flour sacks away from the drip and covered supplies with thick cloth. "This won't hold through the night," he said, studying the damaged section above. "What can we do?" she asked. "I'll climb up and secure it as best I can." Her eyes widened. "In this storm, it'll only get worse if I wait?" Before she could argue further, he was already outside, circling the building. Margaret's chest tightened as she watched through the back window. The wind tugged at his coat as he climbed carefully onto the lower part of the roof. Rain ran down his hat brim and thunder rumbled again. She stood near the door, ready in case he needed anything. Each gust of wind made her heart pound harder. She realized in that moment how deeply she cared for his safety. After what felt like a long time, the pounding noise softened slightly. Cole secured loose boards with rope and nails, working quickly but carefully. When he finally climbed down, he was drenched and breathing heavily, but steady on his feet. "It should hold until morning," he said, stepping back inside. Margaret handed him a dry cloth without thinking. Their fingers brushed briefly. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice carrying more emotion than usual. He shrugged gently. "You would have done the same for me." She knew he was right. The storm lasted most of the night, but the roof held. By morning, the sky cleared, leaving the town damp and quiet. Word of the damage spread quickly. A few townsfolk came by to check on the store. Some even offered help. But Cole arrived first, bringing 2 men from his ranch along with extra lumber. Without making a show of it, they began proper repairs. Margaret stood nearby, watching as he directed the work calmly. There was something reassuring about his presence. Not loud or forceful, but steady. As the men worked, Mrs. Carter approached Margaret with a knowing smile. "He cares for you," she said softly. Margaret did not deny it. By late afternoon, the roof was strong again. The store stood secure against future storms. Cole wiped sweat from his brow and stepped down from the ladder. "All set," he said. Margaret looked up at the repaired roof and back at him. "You didn't have to bring half your ranch to help." He gave a small smile. "I wanted to." There it was again. Not obligation, not expectation, choice. That evening, as the town returned to its usual calm, Margaret and Cole sat once more on the porch. The air smelled fresh after rain. The sky was clear, stars shining brighter than before. "You didn't speak about trading herds tonight," she said gently. He chuckled softly. "I don't need to anymore." She turned toward him. "That night," he continued, "I spoke about value. But value isn't proven in one sentence. It's proven in what a person does when storms come." She felt warmth spread through her chest. "And you showed up," she said. "I'll keep showing up," he replied. The simplicity of those words meant more than any grand promise. Margaret leaned back slightly, looking at the sky. For years she had believed strength meant handling everything alone. The storm had reminded her that allowing someone to stand beside her did not weaken her independence. It strengthened it. The town might watch, people might whisper, but what mattered most was not their opinions. It was the quiet trust forming between them. As the evening grew colder, Cole stood and offered his hand, not to pull her close, not to rush anything, but simply to help her rise from the bench. She accepted it. Her hand fit naturally in his, steady and warm. In that small, simple gesture, Margaret understood something clearly. His first bold words had not been about impulse. They had been about recognition. He had seen her worth long before she was ready to see his. And now, as winter approached and the plains prepared for colder days, neither of them felt quite as alone as before. The storms had tested the roof of the store. But they had also strengthened something far more important, the quiet foundation of 2 hearts learning to trust again. Winter arrived slowly across the plains, covering the dry grass with frost and turning the mornings sharp and white. Smoke curled from chimneys in thin gray lines, and the town of Dry Creek moved at a quieter pace. Wagons rolled more slowly. Ranchers wrapped thick scarves around their necks. The world felt smaller in the cold, as if everyone stayed closer to home. For the first time in many years, Cole did not dread the winter. In the past, winter had meant long nights alone at the ranch house. The wind would press against the walls, and the silence would stretch heavy and endless. He would sit by the fire, staring into the flames, listening to nothing but the ticking of the clock. But this winter felt different. Now, more often than not, he ended his day in town before heading home. Sometimes he helped Margaret close the store. Other times he simply sat with her near the small iron stove inside, warming their hands as snow gathered outside the windows. Margaret also noticed the change in herself. Winter had once been the hardest season after her husband passed. The cold made everything feel sharper. The quiet rooms upstairs, the empty chair at the small kitchen table. She had learned to fill her evenings with work just to avoid thinking too much. Now, the evenings no longer felt so long. One particularly cold night, snow began falling earlier than expected. The streets emptied quickly. Margaret finished serving her last customer and looked outside at the thick white flakes covering the ground. "You won't make it back easily in this," she said to Cole, who stood near the stove, brushing snow from his coat. "I've ridden through worse," he replied, though he glanced outside with careful eyes. The wind picked up, pushing snow sideways across the street. The storm looked stronger than they first thought. "You can stay here until it settles," she offered quietly. "There's extra firewood." "If you're sure." "I am." They secured the shutters tightly and added more wood to the stove. The warmth inside the store grew steady and comforting. Snow tapped softly against the windows, and the world outside faded into white silence. They sat at the small table near the counter, sharing a simple meal of bread and soup Margaret had prepared earlier. It was not a grand feast, but it felt meaningful. As the wind howled outside, Margaret found herself studying Cole in the soft light of the oil lamp. His face looked calmer than it had months ago. The lines of loneliness she once noticed had softened. "You look at peace," she said gently. He gave a small smile. "I am." The honesty in his answer warmed her more than the fire. After the meal, they moved closer to the stove. Snow continued falling heavily. The storm showed no sign of ending soon. "Do you ever think about what comes next?" she asked suddenly. He understood her meaning. Not just the next season, but the next chapter. "I do," he said, "but I don't want to rush you." She shook her head lightly. "It's not about rushing anymore." "For a long time," she continued, "I believed that loving again would mean replacing what I lost. I was afraid of forgetting." "You won't forget," he said softly. She met his eyes. "I know that now." She stood slowly and walked toward the window, watching the snow settle peacefully across the street. "My past will always be part of me," she said, "but it doesn't have to be the only part." Cole rose from his chair, stopping a respectful distance behind her. "I don't want to take the place of your past," he said. "I just want to build a future beside you." Her heart felt steady as she turned to face him. "You once said you would trade 10 herds for one evening," she said with a faint smile. "Do you still believe that?" He stepped closer, his voice calm and sure. "I don't need to trade anything anymore. I would rather build something that lasts longer than one evening." The wind outside began to calm slightly, as if the storm itself was easing. Margaret took a deep breath. She had spent years being strong alone. She had carried grief with dignity. She had rebuilt her life piece by piece. But strength did not mean closing the door to happiness. "Then build it with me," she said quietly. For a moment neither moved. The words settled gently between them. "You're certain?" he asked, not out of doubt, but out of respect. "Yes," she answered. "I'm certain." He reached for her hand, slowly, giving her time to step back if she wished. She did not. Her hand fit into his naturally, as if it had always belonged there. There was no loud celebration, no dramatic gesture, just a steady understanding passing between them. In the days that followed, the news spread gently through Dry Creek. Some people smiled knowingly. Others offered warm congratulations. No one seemed surprised. The town had watched their story unfold from the very beginning. Cole did not sell his ranch, and Margaret did not close her store. Instead, they chose to combine their strengths. He continued managing his land, but he spent more evenings in town. She kept running the store, but now she did not carry every burden alone. On clear winter mornings, he would arrive early to help sweep snow from the porch before she opened. On busy afternoons, she would send fresh bread with him for his ranch hands. Their lives did not change in grand ways, but they changed in steady, meaningful ones. One evening near the end of winter, as the first hints of spring touched the air, they sat once more on the porch. The snow had begun to melt, revealing patches of earth beneath. "Do you remember that first night?" she asked. "I do," he replied. "You spoke boldly. I was afraid if I didn't, I might lose the chance. And now? Now I'm grateful I did. Margaret looked out at the wide land stretching beyond the town. It no longer seemed lonely. It felt open, full of possibility. You know, she said thoughtfully, 10 herds are worth a great deal. He nodded. But loyalty, patience, and kindness are worth more. He squeezed her hand gently. I've learned that, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in soft shades of gold and rose. Margaret felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in years, peace without fear. The cowboy who once measured his life by numbers had found something richer than wealth, and the widow who once guarded her heart so carefully had found that love, when built on respect and steady actions, did not weaken strength. It completed it. Their story did not end with dramatic words or sudden change. It continued in shared mornings, quiet evenings, and simple acts of care. And in the end, it was never about trading 10 herds for one night. It was about choosing one another every day after that.